Imagine a city, not ruins, not rubble, a city with streets wide enough for ox carts, with homes that have indoor drainage, with public granaries stocked and ready, with a harbour that connects to trade routes stretching across an entire subcontinent. Imagine 5 million people, farmers, merchants, priests, children who play in courtyards while their parents haggle over copper and grain, a civilization so organized, so carefully planned, that its streets run perfectly perpendicular to one another, a grid laid out with geometric precision that would not appear again in the ancient world for another 1,000 years. Now imagine that, one morning, none of it is moving anymore, not destroyed, not burned, not conquered, just silent. That is what archaeologists found at Mohenjo-Daro, in what is now Pakistan, when excavations began there in 1921. The Indus Valley civilization had been buried beneath centuries of earth and forgotten so completely that even the people living nearby had no memory of it. No legend, no story passed down by firelight, no name for the people who built those streets. It had not faded slowly from memory, it had simply ceased, and the world had closed over it like water over a stone. George Washington University historian Eric Klein, who has spent decades studying the ancient world, describes something he calls the great silence of the archaeological record, those moments where the evidence just stops, not a chapter ending, not a transition, a full stop, a civilization mid-sentence, and then nothing. The Indus script, which those 5 million people used to keep records and communicate across hundreds of miles of trade network, has never been deciphered. We have found thousands of inscriptions, we have applied computational analysis, linguistic modeling, and decades of scholarly effort, and still nothing. Every symbol in that writing system remains, to this day, unread. Somewhere inside those marks is an entire way of thinking about the world, a cosmology, a legal system, perhaps a literature, and we cannot hear a single word of it. That silence should not exist. Civilizations leave traces. They leave stories. They leave descendants who remember. But the Indus Valley civilization left us streets we can walk and weights we can measure, and seals we can hold in our hands and nothing else. No kings whose names we know. No gods whose myths survived. No wars recorded by the winners. And here is what makes this more than a single mystery. The Indus Valley is not alone. Around 1177 BC, somewhere in the span of a single human lifetime, nearly every major civilization surrounding the eastern Mediterranean collapsed simultaneously. The Mycenaean Greeks, whose palaces at Mycenae and Tiryns had stood for centuries, the Hittite Empire, which had been powerful enough to fight Egypt to a standstill, the city of Ugarit, on the coast of what is now Syria, which was one of the great trading hubs of the ancient world, all of them gone, within roughly 50 years of each other. The last known clay tablet from Ugarit is a desperate letter, a king begging a neighboring ruler for grain, describing enemies attacking from the sea. The tablet was never sent. It was still in the kiln, still hardening, when the city died around it. These are the questions that do not have clean answers. They have theories and evidence and competing interpretations, and they have that same quality, that silence that should not be there. Before we go any further, if you are new here, welcome. This channel is built around exactly these kinds of stories, ancient, buried, unanswered questions that have been waiting centuries for the right set of eyes. If that sounds like something you want more of, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. It means the next video finds you instead of you having to go looking for it. It genuinely makes a difference. Now, back to the silence. Because what is remarkable is not simply that these civilizations vanished. What is remarkable is the pattern, the way the disappearances echo each other across thousands of miles and thousands of years. The same signatures, the same unanswered questions, the same closing of the record, mid-sentence, as if history itself forgot to finish the thought. That pattern is what this documentary is about. And by the end of it, the individual mysteries will matter less than what they share, because what they share is something that no single earthquake, no single drought, no single invading force can fully explain. Something else is happening in that silence, and we are only beginning, very slowly, to learn how to listen for it. There is a version of history that most of us were taught, and it goes something like this. Civilizations rise, they peak, they decline, and eventually they fall. Rome is the template. It took centuries. There were warning signs. There were barbarian pressures and economic strain and political fragmentation and a long, slow unwinding that historians can trace almost decade by decade. When Rome fell, it did not surprise anyone who was paying attention. It was the conclusion of a very long sentence. But that is not the kind of collapse we are talking about here. What we are talking about is something categorically different, something that does not fit the Rome model, or the Greece model, or any of the gradual decline narratives that fill the standard history curriculum. We are talking about civilizations that were, by every measurable indicator, functioning and then were not weakening, not stumbling, functioning, and then silent. The distinction matters more than it might seem at first, because if a civilization declines slowly, it leaves a paper trail. It leaves accounts of battles lost, of harvests failed, of tax rolls shrinking, of populations moving. It leaves a record of its own awareness that something is going wrong. But when a civilization stops suddenly, it leaves something far stranger. It leaves a frozen moment, a city full of objects where the people used to be. Archaeologist Joseph Tainter, in his landmark 1988 study, The Collapse of Complex Societies, identified something that has shaped how researchers think about this problem ever since. He argued that collapse is not the opposite of civilization, it is, in a sense, a feature of it. The more complex a society becomes, the more it depends on that complexity to sustain itself. And complexity has a ceiling. At some point, the energy required to maintain the system exceeds the energy the system can produce. When that happens, collapse is not a failure. It is, in Tainter's framing, a rational simplification. The system sheds what it can no longer afford to carry. That framework is useful. But it still does not fully explain what we see in the archaeological record, because Tainter's model predicts a process. What we find in case after case is something closer to a moment. There are 3 signatures that appear, in some combination, across nearly every civilization in this documentary, and they are worth naming clearly, because they will keep coming up. The first is urban abandonment, with possessions left behind. Not the kind of departure where people pack their belongings and move on. The kind where pottery is still on the shelf, where tools are still in the workshop, where food stores are still in the granary. Archaeologists working at sites from the American Southwest to the Indus Valley have repeatedly uncovered this same image, a life interrupted rather than concluded. The people did not plan to leave permanently, or if they did, they left in a condition that did not allow for careful packing. The second signature is writing that ceases mid-record, not a final entry, not a concluding document, just the last entry, and then nothing after it. The administrative tablets of the Mycenaean palace at Pylos record grain distributions and military preparations right up until the palace burned. The Ugarit letter we mentioned earlier was not a farewell. It was a request for help, still wet with clay when the city ended. Whatever happened, it moved faster than the record keepers could document. The third signature is the simultaneous collapse of trade networks. This one is perhaps the most revealing of all, because trade networks do not collapse accidentally. They collapse when the nodes that sustain them disappear. In the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean, archaeologists have found that copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, grain from Egypt, and luxury goods from the Aegean all moved through the same interconnected system. When that system went silent around 1177 BC, it went silent everywhere at once. Not one node failing and pulling the others down. All of them together, in a span of years that is barely visible in the geological record. Researchers call this synchronous collapse, and it is one of the most debated phenomena in the archaeology of the ancient world, because it demands an explanation that is larger than any single cause. A drought does not stop trade networks across 3,000 miles. A localized invasion does not empty cities on 4 continents. Something systemic has to be in motion. Something that touches the entire network at once, at a level below the surface of what any single king or scribe could see or record. That is the question this documentary is built around. Not simply what happened to any one of these civilizations, but what the pattern across all of them reveals about the nature of collapse itself. Because once you see the 3 signatures, the abandoned possessions, the unfinished records, the simultaneous silence across trade routes, you cannot unsee them. And you will find as we move through each case that the specific causes scholars debate are almost always downstream of something larger, something that was already in motion long before the last tablet was fired, the last road was walked, the last city fell quiet beneath the weight of centuries. That something is what we are going to spend the next 2 hours trying to understand. 5 million people. A writing system we still cannot read. Cities with plumbing more sophisticated than anything Europe would build for another 3,000 years. And then nothing. The Indus Valley civilization did not decline. It simply stopped, and the silence it left behind has never been fully explained. Across the Mediterranean, around 1177 BC, every major Bronze Age power collapsed within a single human lifetime. The city of Ugarit, a clay tablet still hardening in a kiln when the city died around it. A letter asking for help that was never sent. No one recorded what happened, because there was no one left to record it. 10 million people lived in the Maya lowlands at the height of the Classic period. They mapped the stars with extraordinary precision. They built cities whose full scale we are only now beginning to understand, because it took satellite-mounted lasers cutting through a jungle canopy to reveal what had been buried and forgotten beneath the trees for over 1,000 years. Then the cities emptied, and the jungle closed over them like a slow, silent tide. In the American Southwest, a civilization built roads across 250 miles of desert roads that led, in some cases, to nothing. They were gone within a single generation. On American soil, a city once stood larger than London. Its central mound contains more earth than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Almost no one is taught its name, and in 1890, on the coast of North Carolina, a ship returned to find a colony of 117 people had vanished completely. One word carved into a wooden post. No bodies, no graves, no explanation that has ever fully held. 6 civilizations, 6 silences, none of them solved. By the end of this documentary, none of them will be solved either. But what you understand about each of them and what connects them will be something entirely different from what you walked in with. There is a city buried beneath the plains of what is now the Sindh province of Pakistan, and for most of recorded history, no one knew it was there. The people who farmed the land above it had no stories about it, no legends, no name for what lay beneath their feet. The mounds that marked its presence were so unremarkable that for centuries they were simply used as a source of bricks, ancient, fired bricks that local builders pulled from the earth and used to construct railways in the 1800s, unknowingly dismantling one of the most sophisticated urban centres the ancient world had ever produced. When British archaeologist John Marshall authorised systematic excavations at Mohenjo-Daro and at Harappa, several hundred miles to the north, beginning in 1921, what emerged from the ground was not what anyone expected to find. The assumption at the time was that civilization in the ancient world had 2 great early centres, Mesopotamia and Egypt. What Marshall's team uncovered was a third one, and in certain respects, a more remarkable one than either. The Indus Valley civilization, also called the Harappan civilization, stretched across an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. At its height, around 2500 BC, it covered roughly 1 million square miles across what is now Pakistan, northwestern India, and Afghanistan. Scholar Jonathan Mark Kanoya of the University of Wisconsin, one of the leading researchers on this civilization, estimates that the total population across all known Indus sites may have reached 5 million people. That number makes it, by population, the largest civilization of the Bronze Age, and yet almost everything about it remains unanswered. The cities themselves are what make the first impression. Mohenjo-Daro was laid out on a precise grid. Streets ran in straight lines, intersecting at right angles, oriented to the cardinal directions. Houses were built with standardized fired brick, the same dimensions used consistently across sites hundreds of miles apart, suggesting some form of coordinated planning or shared standards that stretched across an enormous geographic area. Most houses had private bathrooms connected to a city-wide drainage system. Wastewater ran through covered brick channels beneath the streets, emptying into soak pits outside the city limits. Public wells were distributed throughout the residential districts. A great public bath, likely used for ritual purposes, was constructed with a waterproof lining of bitumen and surrounded by galleries and changing rooms. Archaeologist Shireen Ratnagar whose research on Harappan trade has reshaped understanding of the civilization's reach, has documented evidence of Indus merchants operating as far away as Mesopotamia. Indus seals small, carved stone objects bearing the undeciphered script have been found in the ruins of Ur. In present-day Iraq, Mesopotamian texts from around 2300 BC refer to trade with a place called Meluha, which most scholars now identify as the Indus Valley. They traded carnelian beads, timber, copper, and textiles. They were, in every measurable sense, a civilization fully connected to the ancient world's broadest economic networks. And then, sometime around 1900 BC, not in a single moment, not in a single place, but across the civilization's core urban centers, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, Rakhigarhi, the archaeological record shows a pattern of gradual urban abandonment that plays out over roughly a century. Buildings stop being maintained. The drainage systems fall into disrepair. The carefully standardized bricks give way to irregular construction. Population densities drop. And eventually, the city's empty. By around 1700 BC, the great urban centers of the Indus Valley are gone. The people do not disappear entirely. There is evidence of population dispersal into smaller rural settlements across a wider area, but the civilization, as a coherent urban phenomenon, has ceased. What caused it is one of the most actively debated questions in South Asian archaeology. For much of the 20th century, the leading theory was invasion. In the 1940s, archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler proposed that the Indus civilization had been destroyed by Indo-Aryan migrants moving into the subcontinent from the northwest. He pointed to skeletal remains found at Mohenjo-Daro bodies lying in the streets, apparently unburied as evidence of a massacre. The theory fit neatly into broader narratives about Indo-Aryan migration and the origins of Vedic culture. It has not held up. Archaeologists have noted, in the decades since Wheeler's proposal, that the skeletal remains he identified do not cluster in a single destruction event. They span multiple periods, and many show signs of disease rather than violence. There is no evidence of burning at a scale consistent with military conquest. There are no weapons caches, no defensive barriers hastily constructed, no mass graves of the kind that appear at sites where ancient cities were actually sacked. The invasion theory, once dominant, is now largely abandoned by mainstream researchers. What replaced it is more complicated, and in some ways more interesting. A 2012 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, drawing on paleoclimate data from across the region, identified a significant and prolonged weakening of the Indian summer monsoon, beginning around 2100 BC. The monsoon is not merely a weather pattern in this part of the world. It is the agricultural foundation of an entire civilization. The rivers that fed the Indus Valley's farming systems, the Indus itself, and the now lost Saraswati River, which once flowed parallel to it through what is now the Thar Desert, depended on consistent seasonal rainfall. When the monsoon weakened, those rivers shrank. When those rivers shrank, the agricultural surplus that had supported 5 million urban residents could no longer be sustained. One theory suggests that this climate shift did not cause an immediate collapse, but rather triggered a slow migration. As the western river systems became less reliable, population centers shifted eastward toward the Ganges plain. The great cities of the Indus core were not abandoned in panic. They were abandoned gradually, as the ecological conditions that had made them possible quietly ceased to exist. But here is what remains unexplained. The Saraswati River itself, which Vedic texts describe as a mighty river flowing to the sea, appears to have desiccated almost completely by around 1900 BC. Satellite imagery and geological surveys conducted in the late 20th century confirmed the existence of a massive ancient river channel running through what is now desert. Its disappearance would have been one of the most significant environmental events in the ancient world, and yet there is no record of it. No lamentation, no inscription describing a great river running dry. In a civilization that maintained sophisticated administrative records across hundreds of sites and thousands of years, the loss of what may have been its most important water source left no written trace we can read. Which brings us back to the script. The Indus script remains one of the most tantalizing unsolved problems in the history of human language. Approximately 4,000 inscriptions have been found on seals, tablets, pottery, and tools. The symbols appear to represent a true writing system. They have consistent internal structure, directional regularity, and patterns that suggest grammatical rules. But no bilingual text has ever been found. There is no Indus Rosetta Stone. Every attempt at decipherment, including computational analyses conducted by researchers at institutions including the Indraprastha Institute of Information Technology, Delhi, has produced competing results that the broader scholarly community has not accepted as conclusive. What this means, practically, is that an entire civilization's inner life is sealed from us. We know what they built. We know roughly what they traded. We can hold in our hands the carved seals they used to mark their goods. And we cannot read a single word they wrote. Their laws, their religion, their literature, their account of their own history. If any of it was recorded in that script, it is buried in a silence we have not yet learned to break. Archaeologists have noted one final detail that resists easy explanation. At Mohenjo-Daro, in the uppermost and therefore most recent occupation layers, the quality of urban life appears to have deteriorated significantly before the city was abandoned. Houses are subdivided into smaller units. Workshops move into spaces that were previously residential. The carefully maintained drainage channels are no longer being cleared. The city, in its final phase, looks like a place under stress, overcrowded, under-maintained, slowly losing the organizational coherence that had defined it for centuries. And then it is empty. No conqueror claims it. No neighboring civilization records its fall. No descendant culture preserves its memory. The Indus Valley civilization built the most sophisticated urban infrastructure of the ancient world, sustained it for 700 years, and then withdrew from history so completely that the civilization that replaced it in the same geography, the Vedic culture, whose texts we can read, appears to have had no knowledge that it had ever existed. 5 million people, 1 million square miles, and a silence so complete that we spent most of recorded history not even knowing to ask what we had lost. 5 million people, 1 million square miles, 7 centuries of urban life, and a silence so complete that we spent most of recorded history not even knowing to ask what we had lost. There is something quietly unsettling about sitting with that thought, the idea that an entire civilization, larger than anything its contemporaries could have imagined, slipped beneath the earth and waited there, undisturbed, for nearly 4,000 years before anyone thought to look. And even now, having looked, we still cannot hear what it was trying to say. If you are listening to this right now, whether it is late at night and the room around you is finally quiet, or early morning with a cup of something warm, or somewhere in the middle of a long commute, drop a note in the comments. Tell us where in the world you are and what time it is where you are sitting. A civilization that left no record of its own people, its own voices, its own ordinary moments. And here we are, listeners, scattered across dozens of countries and time zones, sharing the same unanswered questions in the same moment. It is a small thing, but it is the opposite of that silence. And that feels worth something. If the Indus Valley civilization is a mystery of silence, a world that vanished without leaving us the language to understand it, then the Bronze Age collapse is something different. It is a mystery of noise. We have the records, we have the letters, we have the administrative tablets and the royal correspondence and the desperate final communications of people who knew something catastrophic was happening and were trying, in real time, to stop it. We can read their words, we understand their language. And we still cannot fully explain what happened to them. That is what makes the Bronze Age collapse, in the estimation of many historians, the single most consequential and least understood catastrophe in the ancient world. Not because it erased one civilization, because it erased nearly all of them. Simultaneously, within a span of time so compressed that in geological terms it barely registers roughly 50 years, somewhere around 1177 BC, the entire interconnected system of Bronze Age civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean came apart. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what existed. By the late Bronze Age, the world around the Eastern Mediterranean was, by the standards of the ancient world, genuinely globalized. The great powers of the era Egypt, under the pharaohs of the 19th and 20th dynasties, the Hittite Empire centered in what is now central Turkey, the Mycenaean palace states of mainland Greece, The kingdom of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, the copper-rich island of Cyprus, the Canaanite city-states of the Levant were all connected through dense and ancient trade networks. Copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan and the Caucasus, grain from Egypt, timber from Lebanon, wool textiles from the Aegean, purple dye from the Phoenician coast. These goods moved constantly, across hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles, carried by merchant ships and overland caravans through a system of diplomatic relationships, royal correspondence, and commercial treaties that had been functioning, in some form, for centuries. George Washington University historian Eric Klein, whose 2014 book, 1177b, The Year Civilization Collapsed, has become the defining popular account of this period, describes the Late Bronze Age as an early example of globalization, a world in which the great powers were so economically and diplomatically interdependent that the failure of any single node in the network created cascading pressure across all the others. The Hittite king and the Egyptian pharaoh exchanged letters addressed to each other as brothers. Royal marriages sealed diplomatic alliances across borders. The disruption of a single trade route could trigger shortages felt thousands of miles away. And then, within the lifetime of a single person, it was gone. The Hittite Empire, which had been powerful enough to fight Egypt to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC. One of the largest chariot battles in recorded history, collapsed so completely that its capital city of Hattusa, in central Anatolia, was burned and abandoned around 1180 BC. The Mycenaean palace states of mainland Greece, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, were destroyed and never rebuilt. The Linear B writing system used by Mycenaean administrators disappeared entirely. Greece entered what historians call its Dark Ages, a period of roughly 400 years during which literacy, long-distance trade, and monumental architecture all but ceased. The palace at Pylos, on the southwestern coast of Greece, burned around 1180 BC. The administrative tablets found in its ruins record grain distributions and coastline defense preparations right up until the end. The last entries do not announce a disaster. They are simply the last entries. And then there is Ugarit. Ugarit was one of the great cosmopolitan cities of the ancient world, a trading hub on the Syrian coast, where merchants from Egypt, the Aegean, Anatolia, Cyprus, and Mesopotamia all conducted business, and where the world's earliest known alphabet was developed. In the final years of the city, around 1180 BC, the correspondence recovered from its ruins tells a story of mounting terror. A letter from the king of Al-Ashir, believed to be Cyprus, warns the king of Ugarit that enemy ships have been spotted off the coast. Another letter, from the Hittite viceroy at Carchemish, acknowledges that Ugarit has sent troops and grain to assist in the war effort, but warns that no further help is available. A third letter, found in the city's ruins, is from the king of Ugarit himself, addressed to the king of Al-Ashir. It describes enemy ships attacking from the sea, cities being burned, the countryside in chaos. The letter was never sent. It was found still in the clay kiln where it was being fired for preservation, undelivered, in the ruins of a city that ceased to exist shortly after it was written. Ugarit was burned around 1180 BC and was never rebuilt or reoccupied. The city disappeared beneath a mound the locals called Ras Shamra Cape Fennel and was not rediscovered until 1928. So who, or what, destroyed all of this? The ancient Egyptian records, particularly those of Ramesses III, describe attacks by a confederation of peoples referred to as the Sea Peoples groups, with names like the Peliset, the Tejeka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh, who appear to have moved through the eastern Mediterranean in large numbers, attacking settlements by land and sea. Ramesses claims to have defeated them in a great naval battle around 1175 BC, and the inscriptions at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu depict the battle in vivid detail. Egypt survived barely while almost everything around it did not. But here is where the mystery deepens. Archaeologists have noted, in the decades since the Sea Peoples theory became dominant, that the picture it presents is almost certainly incomplete. The Sea Peoples appear in the Egyptian records as invaders, but there is substantial evidence that at least some of them were themselves refugees, displaced by whatever catastrophe was already unfolding further north. They may have been as much a symptom of the collapse as a cause of it. A group of people set in motion by a disaster they did not create, washing across a civilization already under terminal stress. What remains unexplained is the simultaneity, because the evidence, when assembled carefully, points not to a single cause, but to a convergence of multiple stresses arriving at roughly the same moment across the entire interconnected system. Drought is one of them. Paleoclimate research, including pollen analysis from sediment cores taken from the Sea of Galilee and other regional sites, has confirmed a significant and prolonged drought affecting the eastern Mediterranean beginning around 1200 BC. Brandon Drake, in a 2012 paper published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, analyzed climate proxy data from across the region and found evidence of a 300-year arid period that would have placed severe pressure on the grain-dependent palace economies of the Bronze Age. Egypt, with the Nile's annual flood providing a relatively drought-resistant agricultural system, survived. The rain-dependent economies of the Aegean and Anatolia did not. Earthquakes are another. Historian Robert Drews, in his research on the collapse, identified archaeological evidence of earthquake damage at multiple Bronze Age sites in Greece and Anatolia, dating to roughly the same period. An earthquake swarm, a series of large seismic events across a geologically active region, could have destabilized palace infrastructure across multiple kingdoms simultaneously, creating the kind of cascading institutional failure that opened the door for further disruption. Internal revolts are a third. The palace economies of the late Bronze Age were, by modern standards, extraordinarily extractive. Palace administrators controlled agricultural production, craft manufacturing, and long-distance trade. Ordinary people existed largely to serve the palace system. Under normal conditions, the system's productivity justified its demands. Under the combined stress of drought, disrupted trade, and military pressure, the bargain may have broken down, and the people who had sustained the palaces may have turned against them. One theory suggests, and it is a theory that has gained considerable traction among researchers in recent decades, that the Bronze Age collapse was not a single event with a single cause, but a perfect storm, a systems collapse in Tainter's sense, in which a civilization had become so complex, so interdependent, and so fragile that the simultaneous arrival of multiple stresses, none of which would have been fatal on its own, overwhelmed the system's capacity to recover. The drought reduced agricultural surpluses. The reduced surpluses strained the palace economies. The strained economies could no longer maintain the military and administrative infrastructure that kept trade routes open and populations fed. The disrupted trade routes cut off the supply of tin and copper that Bronze Age military power depended on. And into that widening vacuum moved the displaced populations, the Sea Peoples, who accelerated a collapse that was already underway. What remains unexplained, even within this multi-causal framework, is the completeness of the collapse. Systems under stress typically generate survivors, kingdoms that adapt, cities that find new arrangements, institutions that persist in diminished form. The Bronze Age collapse generated almost none. Greece went dark for 4 centuries. The Hittites never recovered at all. Ugarit was never rebuilt. The long-distance trade networks that had connected the Mediterranean world for centuries dissolved and did not reform in any comparable way for hundreds of years. Archaeologists have noted one detail that sits at the edge of the current evidence and resists incorporation into any clean theoretical model. At several destroyed Bronze Age sites, the destruction layers contain evidence not just of burning but of deliberate demolition, walls pulled down, storage facilities emptied, administrative archives destroyed. This is not the signature of an invading army looting a city. It looks more like the signature of people who wanted to ensure that what had existed there could not be reconstructed. Whether that represents deliberate erasure by outside attackers, internal revolt by populations turning on their own palace systems, or something else entirely remains, as of the current state of the evidence, an open question. What is not open is the scale of what was lost. The interconnected world of the late Bronze Age, its literacy, its trade networks, its diplomatic architecture, its accumulated knowledge of mathematics and astronomy and medicine and craft production, took centuries to rebuild in even partial form. Some of it was never rebuilt at all. The Linear B script died with the Mycenaean palaces and was not replaced by Greek alphabetic writing for several hundred years. An entire tradition of administrative and literary practice, whatever it contained, went with it. A civilization does not have to be forgotten to be lost. Sometimes it simply stops, mid-sentence, and the world that comes after it has to begin again from somewhere much further back than it should have had to. That is what 1177 BC left behind. Not ruins, not a record of what happened, just the absence of everything that had been there before and a clay tablet, still in its kiln, waiting for a reply that never came. Somewhere beneath the jungle canopy of the Guatemalan lowlands, a city the size of medieval Paris sat undisturbed for over 1,000 years. Its pyramids rose above the tree line. Its reservoirs, carefully engineered to capture and store seasonal rainfall, held enough water to sustain tens of thousands of people through months of dry season. Its astronomers had calculated the movements of Venus with an accuracy that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. Its scribes had developed one of the most sophisticated writing systems ever produced in the ancient Americas. A script capable of recording history, poetry, mythology, and the intimate details of royal succession across generations of carved stone monuments. And then, over the course of roughly 200 years, beginning around 800 CE, the cities of the Maya southern lowlands emptied, one by one, and then in accelerating succession, the great urban centers of the classic Maya world fell silent. Tikal, Palenque, Copan, Quirigua, Caracol, dozens of secondary cities, and hundreds of smaller settlements. The last dated monument at Tikal was erected in 869 CE, at Quirigua in 810, at Copan in 822. The long count calendar, which the Maya had maintained with extraordinary precision for centuries, simply stopped being inscribed. The stone monuments that had recorded the deeds of kings in elaborate hieroglyphic detail went uncarved. The reservoirs silted over, the plazas filled with vegetation. The jungle, which the Maya had pushed back for 1,000 years through continuous clearing and maintenance, moved in and did not stop. 10 million people, 2 centuries, and a silence so complete that when Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, they encountered a landscape of ruins so ancient and overgrown that the Maya people they met had largely lost the detailed history of what those ruins represented. The forest had swallowed the memory along with the stone. To understand the scale of what the classic Maya collapse actually involved, it helps to understand what the classic Maya world actually was, because for most of the 20th century, we significantly underestimated it. The standard picture, built from ground-level archaeological surveys conducted over decades, described a landscape of discrete city-states separated by stretches of relatively empty jungle. Cities like Tikal and Calakmul were large and impressive, certainly, but the population estimates attached to them remained conservative. The jungle between cities was assumed to be largely uninhabited, used perhaps for agriculture, but not densely settled. In 2018, that picture was fundamentally revised. The Pacunam LiDAR Initiative, a consortium of researchers working across Guatemala using light detection and ranging technology mounted on aircraft, conducted the largest LiDAR survey ever undertaken in Mesoamerican archaeology. LiDAR works by firing millions of laser pulses at the ground from the air and measuring the return time with extraordinary precision. In open terrain, it produces detailed topographic maps. In jungle terrain, it does something more remarkable. It penetrates the forest canopy and maps the ground surface beneath it, revealing features invisible to conventional aerial photography or ground survey. What the 2018 Pacunam survey revealed beneath the Guatemalan jungle canopy was not a landscape of isolated cities separated by empty forest. It was a fully urbanized landscape, tens of thousands of previously unknown structures, houses, causeways, raised agricultural fields, defensive earthworks, water management infrastructure, covering an area of roughly 800 square miles in the northern Petén region alone. Cities that had been considered modest turned out to be vastly larger than previously mapped. The total population of the classic Maya lowlands, revised upward in light of the LiDAR data, is now estimated by some researchers at somewhere between 7 and 11 million people at the civilization's peak. the implication for understanding the collapse is significant. A landscape that densely settled, that intensively farmed, and that tightly interconnected was not a collection of independent city-states that could fail one at a time without affecting their neighbors. It was a system, and systems of that density and interdependence fail in particular ways. The most extensively documented cause of the classic Maya collapse is drought. David Hodel of the University of Cambridge, whose work on lake sediment cores from the Yucatan region has been central to Maya paleoclimate research, and his collaborators have identified a series of severe and prolonged droughts affecting the Maya lowlands during the terminal classic period, roughly 800 to 900 CE. The evidence comes primarily from the chemical composition of sediments laid down in ancient lakes, specifically the ratio of oxygen isotopes in those sediments, which varies predictably with rainfall patterns. The record is clear. The centuries during which the Maya southern lowlands were abandoned correspond closely to periods of significantly reduced rainfall. The Maya water system was, by the standards of the ancient world, a remarkable piece of engineering. In a landscape with no rivers and a pronounced dry season, the classic Maya cities had developed elaborate systems of reservoirs, canals, and catchment areas capable of storing enough water to sustain large urban populations through months without rain. Tikal's reservoir system, studied in detail by researchers including Vernon Scarborough of the University of Cincinnati, could hold tens of millions of gallons of water, but that system depended on reliable seasonal rainfall to replenish it. A drought severe enough and prolonged enough could exhaust even the most sophisticated water storage infrastructure. One theory suggests that the droughts of the terminal classic period triggered a cascading series of failures. Reduced rainfall meant reduced harvests. Reduced harvests meant reduced ability to sustain the large non-farming populations. The scribes, the builders, the soldiers, the priests, the administrators that the complexity of classic Maya urban life required. Reduced surpluses placed intensifying pressure on the agricultural hinterlands, accelerating the deforestation and soil degradation that were already well underway. And degraded soils, stripped of forest cover and worked intensively for centuries, became less capable of producing adequate yields, even in years of normal rainfall, creating a feedback loop from which there was no straightforward exit. But drought alone does not complete the picture. Archaeologists have noted, across multiple classic Maya collapse sites, evidence of intensifying warfare during the terminal classic period. The epigraphic record, the hieroglyphic inscriptions on stone monuments, shows a significant increase in references to military conflict, captive taking, and the destruction of rival cities in the century before the abandonment of the southern lowlands. Defensive earthworks, previously rare in the Maya archaeological record, begin appearing around major cities. The diplomatic and marriage alliances that had connected city-states across the classic period appear to have fragmented. What remains unexplained is whether this warfare was a cause of the collapse or a consequence of it, whether competition over increasingly scarce agricultural resources drove the conflicts, or whether the collapse of political order created a vacuum into which warfare expanded. The honest answer, based on the current state of the evidence, is probably both simultaneously. There is a second layer to the Maya mystery, one that sits at the intersection of archaeology and history, and it is worth addressing directly. When the Spanish arrived in the Yucatan in the 16th century, they encountered Maya communities that had preserved a living tradition of writing, astronomy, and calendrical knowledge in a series of folded bark paper books called codices. The Maya of the early colonial period possessed a literary and intellectual tradition stretching back centuries. They had, in some form, a connection to the knowledge systems of their classic ancestors. In July of 1562, the Franciscan friar Diego de Landa, acting as the head of the Inquisition in the Yucatan, presided over an auto de fe at the town of Mani, in which he burned an unknown number of Maya codices, along with 5,000 Maya religious idols and a large quantity of other ceremonial objects. De Landa later wrote, in his own account of Yucatan, that he burned the books because they contained nothing but superstition and the deceits of the devil. He also wrote, in the same document, that the Maya wept greatly at their destruction. Of the hundreds or possibly thousands of Maya codices that may have existed at the time of Spanish contact, 4 are known to have survived: the Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, and the recently authenticated Grolier Codex. Everything else, the history, the literature, the astronomical records, the genealogies, the religious texts of an entire civilization, is gone, burned in a single afternoon in a provincial town in the Yucatan. This is not a theory. It is documented history, recorded by the man who ordered it done. Archaeologists have noted that this deliberate destruction of the written record compounds the mystery of the classic collapse in a specific way. Whatever the terminal classic, Maya themselves understood about why their civilization was failing. Whatever analysis, whatever memory, whatever warning was preserved in writing during those final centuries was almost certainly among the materials destroyed in 1562, and in the broader colonial era, suppression of Maya intellectual culture followed. We are not simply missing the evidence because time destroyed it. We are missing it because someone decided it should not exist. What remains unexplained, even setting aside the question of the destroyed codices, is the geographic selectivity of the collapse. The classic Maya collapse was not universal. The southern lowlands, Tikal, Palenque, Copan, and dozens of other major centers were abandoned. But the northern lowlands, centered on cities like Chichen Itza and Uxmal in the Yucatan Peninsula, survived. Some of them flourished. Chichen Itza entered a period of significant growth and political power precisely during the centuries when the southern cities were being abandoned. The northern city of Cobar maintained occupation well into the post-classic period. Why did some cities survive and others did not? The drought data suggests that rainfall patterns differed across the peninsula. The northern Yucatan receives water from a different regional climate system and may have been less severely affected by the terminal classic droughts. But the drought differential alone does not fully account for the political and cultural divergence. One theory suggests that the northern cities had developed different political structures, less dependent on the concentration of royal authority and the elaborate court hierarchies that characterized the classic southern cities, and were, therefore, more resilient when the agricultural and military pressures of the terminal classic arrived. Another theory, less comfortable, suggests that the northern cities did not simply survive the collapse of the south, that refugees, knowledge, and labor from the failing southern cities flowed northward, enriching the northern centers at the expense of the ones being abandoned, that the classic Maya collapse was not a uniform catastrophe, but a redistribution of people, of power, of agricultural capacity that left some parts of the Maya world devastated, and others, for a time, strengthened. The LiDAR data from the Pacunam survey continues to generate new findings. Causeways connecting cities across distances previously thought to be jungle wilderness. Agricultural terracing on a scale suggesting a landscape almost entirely managed by human hands at the height of the classic period. Water management infrastructure canals, check dams, reservoir complexes spread across the lowland landscape far beyond what had been identified through ground survey alone. Each new finding makes the collapse more, rather than less difficult to explain, because each new finding makes the civilization that collapsed larger, more sophisticated, and more deeply rooted in its landscape than the previous estimate had suggested. A civilization that had been managing a 1,000,000 square mile landscape with that degree of intentionality for 500 years does not abandon it without reason. And a reason proportionate to that scale of abandonment, proportionate to 10 million people dispersing from 1,000 cities over 2 centuries, has to be proportionate in its own scale. The droughts were real. The warfare was real. The deforestation was real. The political fragmentation was real. But somewhere in the combination of all of those things, some threshold was crossed beyond which the system could no longer reorganize itself, could no longer redistribute its resources, could no longer persuade enough of its people that staying was better than leaving. And once that threshold was crossed, once the first cities were abandoned, and the agricultural hinterlands contracted, and the trade routes shortened, and the scribes stopped carving dates into stone, the process fed itself. The jungle did not need to be fast. It only needed to be patient, and it had, as it turned out, all the time in the world. There is a road in the desert of northwestern New Mexico that leads, with remarkable geometric precision, toward nothing. It is 30 feet wide. It is arrow straight, deviating from its bearing by less than a degree across distances of miles. Its edges were carefully cleared of stone and brush. In places, its builders cut steps directly into cliff faces to maintain the road's direction rather than allow it to curve around natural obstacles. By every measure of deliberate construction, it is an extraordinary piece of ancient infrastructure, and it ends at an empty cliff. The Great North Road, as archaeologists have named it, runs northward from Pueblo Bonito, the largest and most complex structure in Chaco Canyon, for approximately 30 miles into the San Juan Basin, where it terminates at a place called Coots Canyon, a dramatic promontory of eroded badlands with no apparent practical destination. No agricultural area, no water source, just the edge of the canyon, and below it, silence. The ancestral Puebloans, the people who built Chaco Canyon, who constructed the Great North Road, who created one of the most sophisticated pre-Columbian societies north of Mexico, left behind a landscape full of questions like this one. Structures of breathtaking ambition and precision, oriented to astronomical events with an accuracy that required generations of careful observation. A road network covering over 400 miles across the Colorado Plateau, built by people who had no wheeled vehicles and no draft animals, and who therefore built those roads for reasons that were not primarily logistical. A society that, at its height around 1050 CE, was drawing timber, turquoise, copper bells, macaws, and cacao from sources hundreds of miles in every direction, sustaining a ceremonial and administrative center whose influence reached across an area the size of New England. And then, within a single generation, they were gone. To understand what was lost at Chaco Canyon, you first have to understand what was there. Pueblo Bonito, the great house at the heart of the Chaco system, is a D-shaped structure containing approximately 650 rooms, arranged in a carefully planned arc, rising to 4 stories at its back wall. It was constructed in multiple phases beginning around 850 CE and reaching its final form around 1100 CE. A building project sustained across 2.5 centuries, suggesting not a single ruler's vision, but an institutional commitment that outlasted individual lifetimes. The alignment of its walls to the cardinal directions and to the sunrise and sunset positions at the summer and winter solstices was not accidental. Researchers studying Chaco's architecture, including Anna Sofer of the Solstice Project, have documented a consistent and deliberate orientation of major structures to solar and lunar cycles across the canyon. Chaco was not merely a city. It was, in some sense that we do not yet fully understand, an instrument. The canyon itself sits in a landscape that is, by any agricultural standard, marginal. Annual rainfall averages around 9 inches. Growing seasons are short, and frost comes early. The soil, away from the canyon floor, is thin and unforgiving. Chaco Canyon should not, by the practical logic of agricultural settlement, have been the center of anything. And yet it was. Archaeologists have noted that the volume of food and material goods flowing into Chaco Canyon far exceeded what the local landscape could have produced. The timber used to construct the great houses, over 200,000 wooden beams in Pueblo Bonito, alone came from mountain forests 50 to 80 miles away, carried by human labor across desert terrain with no wheeled transport. The turquoise workshops found at Chaco processed stones sourced from mines near present-day Santa Fe and in other distant locations. Macaws, tropical birds from Mexico, were kept and bred at Chaco in purpose-built aviaries. Cacao residue has been found in ceramic vessels at the site, suggesting that chocolate drinks were being consumed at Chaco. A remarkable finding given that cacao cultivation was centered in Mesoamerica, roughly 1,200 miles to the south. Chaco was, in other words, a place that the surrounding region chose to sustain at enormous collective cost. It drew resources from a network of over 150 outlying communities connected to the canyon by the road system, a network that Timothy Porketat of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and other researchers have described as a pilgrimage economy, a system in which the labor and resources of a wide region were organized around the ritual and ceremonial significance of a central place rather than around straightforward economic exchange. The dendrochronology record the analysis of tree rings in the wooden beams preserved in Chaco's great houses, conducted by researchers at the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona, tells a story of what happened next with unusual precision. Beginning around 1130 CE, the tree ring record shows a dramatic and sustained reduction in rainfall across the Colorado Plateau. The drought that followed was not a single bad year or even a single bad decade. It was a 50-year episode of significantly below-average precipitation in a landscape that was already operating at the edge of its agricultural capacity. The farming communities that supplied Chaco's food could not sustain their surpluses. The pilgrimage economy that had drawn resources from across the region could no longer function when the region itself was under severe stress. And the canyon, which had never been self-sufficient, had no local agricultural reserves to fall back on. By around 1150 CE, the great houses of Chaco Canyon show signs of reduced maintenance and declining occupation. By 1250 CE, the canyon is largely abandoned. The population disperses northward into the Mesa Verde region of southwestern Colorado, eastward toward the Rio Grande Valley, southward toward the Zuni and Hopi plateaus. The road network, without the institutional center it had been built to serve, falls into disuse. But here is where the story of the ancestral Puebloans becomes more complicated than a simple climate narrative and more troubling. Archaeologists have noted, at several sites associated with the collapse of the Chaco system and the subsequent occupation of the Mesa Verde region, evidence of extreme social violence that goes well beyond what drought alone would predict. At a site called Sacred Ridge, near present-day Durango, Colorado, excavated by researchers from the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, evidence was found of a massacre event dating to around 800 CE, predating the main Chaco fluorescence, but within the broader ancestral Puebloan cultural tradition. The remains of at least 35 individuals showed evidence of killing, dismemberment, and processing consistent with what researchers, carefully and after considerable debate, have described as cannibalism. The site was not an isolated anomaly. Similar evidence has been found at several other ancestral Puebloan sites across the Colorado Plateau, concentrated in periods of social stress. What remains unexplained is whether this violence represents a pattern of ritual practice, a response to extreme resource scarcity, evidence of raiding by outside groups, or internal social conflict within communities under pressure, or some combination of all of these. The debate among researchers has been, at times, contentious. Christy Turner of Arizona State University, whose bone bed analysis first brought widespread attention to these findings, argued for a pattern of systematic violence. Other researchers have contested both his methods and his conclusions. The evidence itself is not in dispute. Its interpretation remains actively debated. What is not debated is the evidence of deliberate destruction of sacred spaces. At multiple sites across the Chaco system, archaeologists have found evidence that Great Kivas, the large, semi-subterranean ceremonial chambers that were the spiritual center of ancestral Puebloan community, life were not simply abandoned, but deliberately dismantled. Roof timbers were removed and burned. Floors were systematically broken. Ritual deposits were disturbed. This is not the signature of a community that left expecting to return. It is the signature of a community performing a deliberate act of severance, closing something that had been central to their identity in a way that was meant to be permanent. One theory suggests that this ritual destruction reflects the collapse not just of a physical settlement, but of a belief system. The Chaco system's power had rested partly on the ritual authority of its ceremonial center, the idea that the great houses and kivas of Chaco Canyon were connected to cosmic forces in a way that justified the enormous collective investment in sustaining them. When the drought came, and the harvests failed, and the resources stopped flowing, and the promises of abundance embedded in that ritual system were not kept, the authority of the system collapsed along with its material foundations. And the communities that had built their lives around it responded not with passive departure, but with something more intentional, a rejection, enacted in architecture, of what had failed them. The roads present their own unanswered question. The Chaco Road Network is, by any measure, one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in pre-Columbian North America. 30 feet wide, arrow straight, constructed with deliberate attention to precision across a landscape of considerable topographic variety. Roads of this kind, in the ancient world, are built to move things, armies, trade goods, agricultural surplus. But the Chaco roads, as researchers have studied them more carefully, do not consistently connect places that would have generated significant traffic of that kind. Some run between major outlier communities and the canyon, others run to locations, empty cliffs, isolated mesas, places with no obvious practical significance that make sense only if the roads themselves were the point. Processional routes, ceremonial corridors, lines connecting the human landscape to something in the sky or the earth that we cannot yet fully reconstruct. One theory suggests that the roads encoded cosmological relationships, that their directions were chosen to align with astronomical events or sacred geographical features in ways that gave the road network a ritual meaning independent of its practical utility. This would explain the Great North Road's termination at Chaco Canyon, not a road that failed to reach its destination, but a road that arrived exactly where it was intended to arrive. We do not know. And that is the honest answer. What we do know is that the people who built Chaco Canyon did not vanish. This is one of the most important clarifications that researchers working in this field, including the living Pueblo communities of New Mexico and Arizona, whose oral traditions and cultural practices preserve direct connections to the ancestral Puebloan past, have consistently emphasized. The Hopi, the Zuni, the Acoma, the Tewa-speaking Pueblos of the Rio Grande Valley, these are not the distant descendants of the ancestral Puebloans in some vague biological sense. They are, in a culturally continuous and directly traceable sense, the same people. Their pottery traditions, their ceremonial practices, their architectural forms, their cosmological frameworks, all of them carry recognizable continuities with what archaeologists find at Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. The people did not disappear. They moved. They reorganized. They carried their knowledge and their identity with them into new landscapes and new community forms. And they are still here. What disappeared was the system. The great houses and the road network and the pilgrimage economy and the ceremonial center that had organized a region's worth of labor and belief for 2 centuries that ended. And in ending, it left behind those 30-foot wide roads running arrows straight across the desert, past empty cliffs, toward horizons that no longer held what they once had promised. There is a mound rising out of the floodplain of the Mississippi River, just east of present-day St. Louis, Illinois, that contains more earth than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is 100 feet tall. Its base covers 14 acres. It was built entirely by human hands, without metal tools, without wheeled vehicles, without draft animals basket by basket, load by load, over a period of roughly 2 centuries, by a population whose existence most Americans have never been taught to consider. At its summit, a wooden structure once stood that overlooked a city of somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people, a city larger, at its peak around 1100 CE, than London was at the same moment in history. The city was called Cahokia, and almost no one knows it existed. That fact, the near-total absence of Cahokia from the standard American historical curriculum, is not, by itself, evidence of deliberate suppression. There are straightforward institutional and academic reasons why a pre-Columbian North American city receives less attention than Rome or Athens or even Tenochtitlan. But the gap between what Cahokia was and how little space it occupies in public historical consciousness is large enough and consequential enough that it is worth naming honestly before moving on to the archaeology. Timothy Pauketat, an archaeologist at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, whose research on Cahokia has been among the most influential of the past 3 decades, has described the site as the most important archaeological location in North America, a place where, for roughly 3 centuries, the largest and most complex pre-Columbian society north of Mexico flourished, declined, and disappeared, leaving behind a landscape of earthen monuments that were so poorly understood by European settlers that they were variously attributed to the Vikings, to a lost tribe of Israel, and to refugees from the mythical continent of Atlantis. The idea that they were built by the ancestors of the people who already lived there by indigenous North Americans was, for a long time, considered less plausible than any of those alternatives. It was not less plausible. It was simply less comfortable. The site, now protected as Cahokia Mound State Historic Site, a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1982, covers approximately 4,000 acres near Collinsville, Illinois, and contains the remains of over 120 earthen mounds of varying sizes and purposes. Monk's Mound, named after a group of French Trappist monks who farmed its terraces in the early 19th century. Long after the city it had once dominated was gone, is the largest of them and the largest prehistoric earthen structure in North America, but it is surrounded by platform mounds, burial mounds, and marker mounds that together define the spatial organization of what was, at its height, a genuinely urban landscape. The city that archaeologists have reconstructed from excavation and survey data was not a simple aggregation of villages. It had a planned central precinct enclosed by a 2-mile wooden stockade wall that was rebuilt at least 4 times over the course of Cahokia's occupation. A significant investment of labor, suggesting that the wall served not merely a defensive function, but a symbolic one, demarcating the sacred core of the city from its surrounding neighborhoods. Within the stockade, the great mounds were arranged around open plazas in a pattern that reflected deliberate cosmological organization oriented to the cardinal directions, structured around axes, connecting the positions of the sun at solstices and equinoxes. To the west of the main precinct, archaeologists excavated a series of large circular features, post holes from massive timber circles that researchers have called woodhenges, after the famous Neolithic monument in England. The circles at Cahokia were almost certainly astronomical instruments, used to track the positions of the rising sun at critical points in the agricultural and ceremonial calendar. The largest of them was approximately 410 feet in diameter. Its posts were aligned to mark the equinoxes and solstices with remarkable precision. Cahokia was not a village that grew large. It was a city that was, in a meaningful sense, designed. The question of what created Cahokia so suddenly is almost as interesting as the question of what ended it. The archaeological record shows a striking discontinuity around 1050 CE, a date that researchers have called the Cahokian Big Bang. Before that date, the site shows evidence of relatively modest occupation consistent with the regional pattern of late woodland settlements. After it, within what appears to be a very short period, perhaps a single generation, the population of the site increases dramatically. The mound-building program accelerates, and the material culture shows a sudden efflorescence of new forms in pottery, figurines, and ritual objects. Something happened around 1050 CE that transformed a regional settlement into a metropolitan center almost overnight. One theory suggests that the transformation was religious in nature, that a charismatic leader or movement introduced a new cosmological framework that rapidly attracted followers from across the surrounding region, creating a pilgrimage center whose population growth was driven by ideological conversion rather than straightforward agricultural expansion. Porketat, in his research on what he calls the Cahokian religion, has documented evidence of large-scale feasting events and ritual depositions at the site, consistent with the kind of periodic mass gatherings that characterize pilgrimage centers across the ancient world. What is less contested is what the city looked like at its height. Beyond the central precinct, residential neighborhoods spread across the floodplain in every direction. Craftspeople produced pottery, shell ornaments, and copper objects in workshops that distributed their products across a trade network reaching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. The distinctive Cahokian ceramic style, shell-tempered pottery with characteristic surface treatments has been found at sites across the American Midwest and Southeast, testimony to the reach of Cahokia's cultural influence. Marine shells from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Lake Superior region, and chert from quarries hundreds of miles away all made their way to Cahokia through exchange networks whose full extent is still being mapped. And then, beginning sometime around 1200 CE, the decline of Cahokia was not as sudden as its rise, but it was, by the end, equally complete. The mound-building program, which had been the most visible expression of the city's institutional capacity, slows and then stops. The wooden stockade wall is rebuilt one final time and then not maintained. The outer neighborhoods are abandoned first, then the inner residential areas, and finally, by around 1350 CE, the central precinct itself falls out of active use. By the time European explorers reached the Mississippi Valley in the 17th century, Cahokia was empty. The Alaini people who lived in the region at that time appear to have had no tradition connecting them to the city whose mounds rose from the floodplain of their river. The French explorer Robert de La Salle, traveling through the area in 1682, made no record of encountering any oral tradition that explained what the mounds were or who had built them. The causes of Cahokia's decline are, predictably, multiple and interrelated. A massive flood event is one of them. Sediment analysis conducted at the site has identified a significant flood layer deposited sometime in the late 12th or early 13th century, a catastrophic inundation of the floodplain that would have destroyed agricultural land, damaged infrastructure, and displaced large numbers of people from the low-lying residential areas that made up most of the city's population. A single flood of sufficient magnitude could have disrupted the agricultural surplus system that supported Cahokia's non-farming population, triggering a population decline that the city's institutional structures were unable to reverse. Deforestation is another. The construction of Cahokia's mounds, stockade walls, and wood henge posts consumed enormous quantities of timber. Estimates suggest that the wooden palisade wall alone required roughly 20,000 trees for each of its reconstructions. As the forests surrounding the city were progressively cleared for construction and agriculture, the soil stability and water retention of the landscape declined, increasing the severity of both floods and droughts and reducing the long-term agricultural productivity of the land that the city depended on. Archaeologists have noted that the deforestation evidence at Cahokia follows a pattern recognizable from other cases. In this documentary, a civilization consuming the ecological foundations of its own existence faster than those foundations could regenerate. Political fragmentation is a third factor, though it is the least directly documented. The scale of Cahokia's institutional achievement, the coordinated labor required to build and maintain the mounds, the stockade, and the plazas implies a degree of centralized authority that would have been difficult to sustain over multiple generations in the absence of the ideological cohesion that apparently drove the city's founding. As the promises embedded in the Cahokian cosmological system went unfulfilled as the floods came and the harvests failed and the population declined, the authority of the central institutions may have eroded in ways that accelerated the physical abandonment. What remains unexplained is the silence, not the silence of the city itself that can be attributed, in varying proportions, to the causes described above. What remains unexplained is the silence in the oral traditions of the region's later indigenous inhabitants. Oral tradition is, in most cultures, a remarkably durable vehicle for historical memory. Stories of significant places and significant events survive for centuries and sometimes millennia in oral form. The Aboriginal Australians have oral traditions that researchers have connected to geological events more than 10,000 years old. The ancestral Puebloans are remembered, directly and continuously, by their living descendants in the Rio Grande Pueblos. But Cahokia, a city of 10,000 to 20,000 people, the dominant cultural center of the American Midwest for 3 centuries, appears to have left almost no recoverable oral tradition among the peoples who occupied its former territory in the centuries after its abandonment. No stories about the Great Mound, no memory of the city that stood there, no legend of the people who built it. Archaeologists have noted that this absence of oral memory may itself be evidence of the nature of the collapse. A community that disperses gradually, maintaining social cohesion across the dispersal, carries its stories with it. A community that fragments under severe stress, scattering in multiple directions, losing its institutional structures, perhaps suffering significant mortality, may lose the social mechanisms by which stories are transmitted and preserved. The silence in the oral record may not mean that no one remembered. It may mean that the conditions necessary for remembering did not survive. Monk's Mound still stands. It is accessible to visitors, and on a clear day the street Louis Arch is visible from its summit across the river. The UNESCO designation has brought a degree of protection and attention, but the site receives a small fraction of the visitors that comparably significant archaeological sites in Europe or Central America attract annually, and it appears in a small fraction of the history curricula taught in the schools of the state in which it stands. A city once rose here, larger than any in contemporary England, built by people whose names we do not know in a language we cannot speak, organized around a cosmological vision whose full content we have not recovered. It sustained itself for 3 centuries, and then, under the accumulated weight of flood and drought and political fracture, it quietly ceased. And the river that had fed it kept moving south, as it always had, carrying no memory of what had stood on its banks. Every case we have examined so far sits at a comfortable distance from the present. The Indus Valley civilization ended nearly 4,000 years ago. The Bronze Age collapse happened more than 3 millennia in the past. Even Cahokia, the most recent of the great pre-Columbian mysteries, was abandoned roughly 6.5 centuries ago. That distance, temporal, cultural, geographic, makes it easier, in some sense, to hold the mystery at arm's length, to treat it as archaeology rather than something more immediate. Roanoke is different. Roanoke happened in 1587. The people who vanished there were English-speaking Europeans whose names are recorded in colonial documents. Their governor, John White, was a trained artist whose watercolor paintings of the Carolina coast and its indigenous inhabitants survive to this day in the British Museum. Their settlement was established under a charter granted by Queen Elizabeth I. The colony's records, such as they were maintained in a bureaucratic tradition continuous with the one that produced the documents now sitting in archives in London, and we still do not know what happened to them. 117 men, women, and children, including White's own daughter Eleanor Dare and his granddaughter Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, were left on Roanoke Island, in what is now Dare County on the outer banks of North Carolina. In the summer of 1587, White sailed back to England for supplies almost immediately after the colony was established. A combination of the Spanish Armada crisis and subsequent naval disruptions prevented him from returning for 3 years. When he finally reached Roanoke Island in August of 1590, the settlement was empty, not destroyed, not burned in the manner of a violent attack, abandoned in a manner that suggested deliberate and relatively orderly departure. The structures of the settlement had been dismantled, not knocked down by force, but taken apart, as if the materials were being salvaged for use elsewhere. The colonists' heavy equipment and some of their larger possessions had been buried, apparently to protect them from weather, and carved into a post of the fort's entrance, in clean capital letters, was a single word: Vu Croatoan. On a nearby tree, the letters CRO had been carved, apparently begun and then abandoned in favor of the longer inscription on the post. White had previously arranged with the colonists that if they moved from Roanoke Island for any reason, they would carve the name of their destination. If the move had been made under duress, they would add a Maltese cross above the carving. The word Croatoan referred to an island approximately 50 miles to the south, present-day Hatteras Island, and to the indigenous Croatoan people who lived there. White attempted to reach Croatoan Island, but was prevented by deteriorating weather and the unwillingness of his ship's captains to risk the journey. He returned to England without setting foot on the island, where his daughter and granddaughter had last been known to be alive. He never returned to the Americas. The question of what happened to the Roanoke colonists has generated an enormous volume of research, speculation, and competing claims over the 4.5 centuries since White found the empty settlement. The honest assessment of where that research currently stands is more interesting and more nuanced than the mystery's popular reputation as simply unsolvable might suggest. The First Colony Foundation, a non-profit research organization based in North Carolina that has been conducting systematic archaeological and documentary research on the lost colony since 2004, has produced findings that significantly complicate the simple narrative of 117 people vanishing without a trace. One of the most significant of those findings involves a map. Among the artifacts preserved in the British Museum is a map of the Carolina coast drawn by John White during his time at Roanoke. A detailed examination of the map conducted by researchers from the First Colony Foundation and the British Museum, published around 2012, revealed that a patch had been applied to the map over a location approximately 50 miles inland from Roanoke Island, near the junction of the Chowan and Roanoke rivers. Beneath the patch, visible under certain lighting conditions, and subsequently confirmed through imaging analysis, was a symbol that matched the symbol used on other Elizabethan maps to indicate a fort. The patch appeared to have been applied deliberately to conceal the marking. One theory suggests that this hidden symbol represents a planned secondary settlement, a location to which at least some of the Roanoke colonists intended to relocate, moving inland away from the vulnerable coastal position of the original settlement. Archaeological surveys conducted by the First Colony Foundation at the location indicated by the concealed symbol, a site in Bertie County, North Carolina, have recovered English-made artifacts dating to the late 16th century, including a fragment of a type of sword handle used in England in the 1580s and 90s, and pottery shards consistent with English colonial production of that period. The evidence is preliminary. It does not confirm the presence of the Roanoke colonists specifically, but it is consistent with the hypothesis that some portion of the colony relocated inland rather than remaining on the island where White found only the carved word. The Croatoan connection has been pursued through a different line of research, one that moves from archaeology into genetics and oral tradition. Roberta Estes, a genetic genealogist who has conducted extensive research into the ancestry of the Lumbee people, a Native American nation centered in Robeson County, North Carolina, whose origins have been the subject of considerable scholarly debate, has documented genetic and genealogical evidence suggesting connections between some Lumbee family lines and the surnames of the Roanoke colonists. The Lumbee themselves have long maintained an oral tradition, asserting partial descent from the lost colonists, and several Lumbee family names, Dare, Harvey, Sampson, among others, correspond directly to names on the Roanoke colony's roster. The genetic evidence is complex and contested. It does not provide definitive proof of Lumbee descent from the Roanoke colonists, but it is consistent with the broader hypothesis that the colonists, or a significant portion of them, were absorbed into indigenous communities in the Carolina coastal plain rather than dying as a group. They did not vanish. They dissolved into a people, a culture, and a landscape that eventually incorporated them so completely that the boundary between the English colonists and their indigenous hosts became, over generations, impossible to locate. What remains unexplained is the deliberateness of what was left behind. The word Croton was not written in panic. It was carved carefully, in capital letters, into a solid wooden post. The settlement had been dismantled in an orderly manner. Possessions had been buried for preservation. These are the actions of people who expected, at some level, to be understood, who believed that the word they left would be legible to whoever came looking, and that it would point toward them. John White understood it. He knew exactly what the word meant and where it pointed. He simply could not get there. That gap between the message left and the response that never arrived is what makes Roanoke different from the other mysteries in this documentary. The Indus Valley civilization left us a script we cannot read. The Bronze Age collapse left us tablets mid-sentence. The Maya left us 4 surviving books from a library of thousands. But the Roanoke colonists left us a word we can read perfectly, pointing toward a destination we can locate on a map. And we still spent 4 centuries failing to follow it. The mystery of Roanoke is not, at its core, a mystery of evidence. It is a mystery of attention, of what gets followed up and what gets set aside, of which disappearances generate the resources necessary to answer the questions they leave behind, and which ones simply wait. Virginia Dare would be 438 years old this year. The word she and her community left on that post is still the clearest thing about them. We have spent the last several hours moving through individual cases, 5 civilizations and 1 smaller but more recent vanishing, each with its own geography, its own timeline, its own specific combination of stresses and failures. The Indus Valley and its silent script, the Bronze Age and its unanswered letters, the Maya and their jungle-swallowed cities, the ancestral Puebloans and their roads to nowhere, Cahokia and its forgotten mound rising above a river that carries no memory of what once stood on its banks. Taken individually, each case is a mystery. Taken together, they are something else. They are a pattern. And the pattern is more unsettling than any of the individual cases, because it suggests that what destroyed these civilizations was not particular to any one of them. It was not the specific drought that hit the Yucatan, or the specific sea peoples that moved through the eastern Mediterranean, or the specific flood that inundated Cahokia's floodplain. What made them fatal was something that all of these civilizations shared, something structural, something that grew directly out of their greatest achievements, and something that made them, paradoxically, more vulnerable the more successful they became. Joseph Tainter identified the core of it in 1988, and his framework has held up remarkably well against 4 decades of subsequent archaeological research. The argument is this: complexity is how civilizations solve problems. When a drought reduces agricultural yields, a complex society can redistribute food from surplus regions to deficit ones. When external threats emerge, a complex society can mobilize resources for defense. When population grows beyond what local production can sustain, a complex society can extend its trade networks. Complexity, in the form of administrative hierarchies, trade networks, specialized labor, infrastructure, is the toolkit that allows large human societies to survive challenges that would destroy simpler ones. But complexity is not free. It requires energy to maintain. Every additional layer of administration, every additional mile of road, every additional specialist who does not grow their own food, all of it must be sustained by the agricultural and resource surplus that the society's farmers and laborers produce. And here is the problem. The returns on complexity are not linear. Early investments in complexity tend to produce large returns. A modest administrative system can dramatically increase agricultural efficiency and trade volume. But as complexity increases, the marginal return on each additional increment of complexity tends to decline. You reach a point where the energy required to maintain the system begins to approach the energy the system produces. And when a stress arrives at that point, a drought, a flood, an external shock, there is no surplus left to absorb it. Tainter called this the marginal return on complexity. What remains unexplained, even within his framework, is why so many civilizations appear to have reached that threshold at roughly similar moments in their developmental trajectories, and why the collapse, when it comes, tends to be so complete. Brandon Drake's 2012 paper in the Journal of Archaeological Science added an important dimension to this picture. Drake's analysis of paleoclimate proxy data from across the eastern Mediterranean and southwest Asia identified a period of significant climatic instability, beginning around 1200 BC, the precise window of the Bronze Age, collapse characterized by increased drought frequency and reduced agricultural productivity across a wide geographic area. What his analysis showed was not simply that drought occurred during the collapse period. It showed that the climate stress was regional in scale, affecting multiple civilizations simultaneously, in a pattern that matched the geographic footprint of the interconnected Bronze Age trade network. In other words, the climate did not selectively target one civilization and spare its neighbors. Archaeologists have noted that this finding has significant implications for how we understand synchronous collapse, the phenomenon in which multiple interconnected civilizations fail within the same compressed time frame. If each civilization in a network is individually stressed to the point where its complexity can no longer generate positive returns, and if an external shock then arrives that is large enough in geographic scale to affect all of them simultaneously, the network itself becomes a liability rather than an asset. The trade connections that had allowed civilizations to buffer local shortfalls by drawing on distant surpluses now transmit the shock rather than absorbing it. There are no distant surpluses, because the distant civilizations are under the same stress. This is the synchronous collapse mechanism, and it appears in some form in every case we have examined. The Bronze Age trade network transmitted the terminal Bronze Age crisis across the entire eastern Mediterranean simultaneously. The Maya lowland cities, connected by causeways and exchange networks whose full extent the Pacunam LiDAR data is still revealing, collapsed in a wave that moved across the landscape rather than striking each city independently. The Chaco system's outlier communities, linked to the canyon center by roads and pilgrimage obligations, declined together as the center lost its capacity to justify the costs of the network. Cahokia's regional exchange system, which had drawn resources from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, contracted as the city's institutional authority eroded. One theory suggests that the very feature of these civilizations that made them most impressive, their connectivity, their reach, their ability to integrate resources and information across vast distances, was precisely what made them most vulnerable to synchronous failure. A civilization that stands alone fails alone. A civilization embedded in a network of interdependencies can draw on that network when times are good and can buffer shocks that would destroy an isolated community. But when the shock is large enough and broad enough to stress the entire network simultaneously, the connectivity that had been a source of resilience becomes a transmission mechanism for collapse. The counterintuitive finding that archaeologists have noted across multiple collapse studies is this. In the aftermath of each of the collapses we have examined, the communities that recovered most quickly and most completely were not the most complex ones. They were the simpler, more locally self-sufficient communities at the periphery of the collapsed network's communities that had been less fully integrated into the system, that had maintained more direct relationships between their labor and their subsistence, and that therefore had less complexity to maintain and less to lose when the network failed. Complexity built these civilizations. That is the pattern across the patterns. Not a single cause, not a single villain, not a drought or an invasion or a political failure that can be isolated and blamed. A structural condition built into the logic of civilizational growth itself that made these societies, at their peaks, simultaneously the most capable and the most fragile human communities their worlds had ever produced. We have now seen it happen 5 times, across 5 continents, across 3,000 years of human history. The question that the next section of this documentary turns toward is the one that has been present, unspoken, since the cold open. We are, by every measure, the most complex civilization in the history of the planet. Our trade networks span every ocean. Our administrative systems coordinate the labor of 8 billion people. Our cities depend on supply chains whose individual nodes are separated by thousands of miles and dozens of national borders. We have seen this before. There is a question that runs beneath every case we have examined, quieter than the questions about drought and trade networks and political fragmentation, but in some ways more fundamental. It is not simply why these civilizations ended. It is what we lost when they did, and more specifically, how much of what we lost was lost not to time and entropy, but to deliberate human action. The distinction matters. A city abandoned to the jungle and slowly consumed by roots and rainfall is one kind of loss. A library burned by someone who decided its contents should not exist is another kind entirely. But only one of them was chosen. Begin with the oldest silence in this documentary. The Indus script remains, as of the current state of research, undeciphered. Approximately 4,000 inscriptions survive, preserved on seals and pottery and small tablets, and not one of them can be read with scholarly consensus. Computational linguistics researchers, including teams working at institutions across South Asia and Europe, have applied statistical analysis, machine learning models, and comparative linguistic frameworks to the problem for decades. What this means, in practical terms, is that an entire tradition of thought, whatever the Indus Valley people believed about the world, about the gods, about the nature of justice and the proper ordering of society, is sealed inside a writing system that may never be opened. This is not deliberate erasure. This is the erasure that time and discontinuity produce when a civilization ends completely enough that no one carries the knowledge of its writing system into the cultures that follow. The Indus script did not survive because the civilization that used it did not survive in a form that could transmit it. The silence is accidental, but it is no less absolute for that. Now consider what is not accidental. In July of 1562, as we noted in the Maya section of this documentary, the Franciscan friar Diego de Landa burned an unknown number of Maya codices at Mani in the Yucatan. De Landa was not acting in ignorance of what he was destroying. He was educated. He was, in fact, deeply interested in Maya culture. He later wrote one of the most detailed accounts of Maya life and history produced by any Spanish colonial figure, a document called Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, which preserves information about Maya writing and calendar systems that scholars have relied on heavily ever since. He knew what the books were. He burned them anyway. 4 Maya codices survive. 4, from a civilization that, at its height, maintained a literate tradition across hundreds of cities and 10 million people. Whatever those 4 surviving books contain astronomical tables, ritual calendars, divinatory almanacs, they represent an almost incomprehensibly small fraction of what once existed. The histories are gone, the literature is gone, the medical knowledge accumulated across a millennium of careful botanical observation in one of the world's most biodiverse landscapes is gone. The theological debates, the philosophical traditions, the accounts of the terminal classic collapse written by people who lived through it, all of it gone, in an afternoon, in a provincial town in the Yucatan. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous example of this kind of loss in the Western historical imagination, though its story is more complicated than the popular version suggests. Lionel Casson, the classical scholar whose work on ancient libraries and seafaring remains standard reference material, documented that the library at Alexandria was not destroyed in a single catastrophic fire, but diminished through multiple events across several centuries. Julius Caesar's accidental fire in 48 BC the decree of Theophilus in 391 CE, and the Arab conquest of 642 CE among them. The cumulative effect was the same, regardless of whether it happened at once or incrementally. A repository that had gathered the intellectual production of the ancient Mediterranean world across centuries was reduced to nothing. What was in it that we will never read? The lost plays of Sophocles and Euripides, of which we have fragments. The complete works of Aristotle, of which we have perhaps a third. The geographical treatises, the medical encyclopedias, the philosophical schools whose arguments we know only through the responses of writers who disagreed with them. The history of Carthage, written by Carthaginians, a civilization we know almost entirely through the accounts of the Romans who destroyed it. Entire traditions of thought, accessible to the ancient world and lost to ours, because the physical objects that contained them did not survive the decisions of the people who controlled the spaces where they were kept. More recently, and this requires no archaeology, only a functioning memory, Donnie George Ukana documented in detail the looting of the museum that occurred in April of 2003. In the days following the United States invasion of Iraq, approximately 15,000 objects were removed from the museum's collections in those days, including artifacts from Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian civilizations, some of them among the oldest human-made objects ever recovered. Some have been returned, many have not. They sit in private collections, or have been sold through antiquities markets, whose opacity is, by design, difficult to penetrate. Archaeologists have noted that the loss of context is often as damaging as the loss of the objects themselves. An artifact removed from its archaeological context, from the layer of soil in which it was buried, from its spatial relationship to the objects surrounding it, from the stratigraphic sequence that places it in time, loses much of its informational value. It becomes an aesthetic object rather than a historical document. The story it could have told, properly excavated and analysed, cannot be reconstructed from the object alone. What remains unexplained, across all of these cases, is how to account for the cumulative weight of deliberate erasure in shaping what history is allowed to know. The accidental losses the civilizations that ended and took their languages with them, the libraries diminished by fire and neglect, and the slow decay of papyrus are grievous enough. But layered on top of them is a separate category of loss, the knowledge that someone decided should not exist, the books that were burned by people who understood what they were burning, the artifacts removed from context by people who understood what they were taking. The silence in the archaeological record is not uniform. Some of it is the silence of time, and some of it is the silence of choice. Both kinds are permanent, but only one of them was necessary. There is a temptation, having spent several hours moving through the ruins of vanished civilizations, to arrive at a comfortable conclusion, to decide that what happened to the Indus Valley people, or the Bronze Age palace kingdoms, or the classic Maya, was the product of conditions specific to their time and place, conditions that we, with our satellite imaging and our climate modelling and our global institutions, have either transcended or learned to manage. To treat the collapses we have examined as historical curiosities, rather than as data points in a pattern that has not finished producing data points, that temptation is worth resisting, not because collapse is inevitable, the evidence does not support that conclusion, but because the specific mechanisms that destroyed the civilizations in this documentary are not mechanisms that belonged exclusively to the ancient world. They are structural. They grow out of the logic of complexity itself, and we are, by every available measure, the most complex civilization that has ever existed on this planet. Let us be precise about what that means. Joseph Tainter's framework, which we introduced earlier in this documentary, identifies the core vulnerability as the declining marginal return on complexity. Every problem a complex society faces, it solves by adding complexity, more administration, more infrastructure, more specialization, more interdependence. And for a long time, that works. The returns are positive. The complexity pays for itself in increased productivity, increased security, increased capacity to buffer shocks. But the returns decline as complexity accumulates, and at some point, the system is spending more energy maintaining itself than it is gaining from the maintenance. The Bronze Age trade network that connected Cyprus to Egypt to the Aegean to Anatolia was, in Tainter's terms, a complexity investment that paid enormous returns for centuries, allowing each node in the network to specialize, to produce surpluses in its areas of comparative advantage, and to trade those surpluses for things it could not produce locally. But that network also created a fragility. Each node became dependent on the continued functioning of all the others. When the climate stress of around 1200 BC arrived and simultaneously reduced agricultural surpluses across the entire network, there were no external reserves to draw on. The network, which had been the system's greatest strength, became the mechanism of its failure. Now consider the global supply chain of 2021. In March of that year, a single container ship, the Ever Given, 360 meters long, ran aground in the Suez Canal and blocked the waterway for 6 days. During those 6 days, approximately 12% of global trade was disrupted. Consumer goods, agricultural products, manufactured components, energy resources, all of it backed up behind a single grounded vessel in a waterway that is, in geological terms, barely a scratch in the desert. The disruption was resolved relatively quickly, and the global economy absorbed it without catastrophic consequence. But the event revealed, with unusual clarity, the degree to which the complexity of global trade has created exactly the kind of single-point vulnerabilities that Tainter's framework would predict. This is not an isolated example. The semiconductor shortage that began in 2020 and extended well into 2022 demonstrated that the global manufacturing system, the most complex production network in human history, had concentrated the production of a critical component in a small number of facilities in Taiwan and South Korea. The disruption of that supply, triggered initially by pandemic-related factory closures and amplified by a surge in demand for consumer electronics, produced cascading shortages across the automotive, electronics, and medical device industries worldwide. The complexity of the global manufacturing system had, in Tainter's terms, created a negative return. The efficiencies gained by concentrating semiconductor production in a few specialized facilities were outweighed, in a crisis scenario, by the systemic fragility that concentration created. The Bronze Age palace administrators who concentrated tin production in a small number of distant sources, and whose entire military capacity depended on the continued supply of that tin to alloy with copper into bronze, would have recognized the dynamic immediately. One theory suggests, and it is a theory grounded in systems science rather than in purely historical analogy, that the vulnerability of complex systems to synchronous collapse increases as a function of both the density of their interconnections and the degree to which individual nodes have sacrificed local resilience in favor of network efficiency. A subsistence farmer who grows a diverse set of crops and stores a season's surplus locally is, in purely technical terms, inefficient compared to a specialized commercial farmer integrated into a global commodity market. But the subsistence farmer can survive a disruption in the commodity market that would be catastrophic for the specialized farmer. Efficiency and resilience are, in many circumstances, inversely related, and the global economy has, over the past several decades, pursued efficiency with extraordinary commitment and single-mindedness. The climate data adds a dimension that is difficult to set aside. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Sixth Assessment Report, published in 2021, documents with high confidence that the global climate is warming at a rate unprecedented in the past 2,000 years, and that the consequences of that warming increased drought frequency in already dry regions, disruption of seasonal rainfall patterns, sea level rise affecting coastal agricultural land, increased frequency of extreme weather events are consistent with the specific climate stresses that the paleoclimate record identifies as triggers in the collapses we have examined. The terminal classic Maya, drought; the Bronze Age, aridification; the 50-year drought that emptied Chaco Canyon. The climate mechanisms are not identical, but they are recognizably similar in their effects on agricultural productivity and water availability. Archaeologists have noted, across multiple collapse studies, that climate stress alone does not cause collapse. What climate stress does is reduce the margin for error in societies that are already operating near the limits of their complexity. A civilization with substantial surplus capacity and genuine systemic resilience can absorb a generation of reduced rainfall. A civilization operating at the edge of its complexity ceiling, maintaining its institutions only because everything is working as designed, cannot. The question of which description applies to our own civilization is not one that this documentary is in a position to answer definitively. That is genuinely a matter of active research and legitimate disagreement among scientists, economists, and historians. What remains unexplained, and what the evidence from the cases in this documentary does not resolve, is where exactly on the complexity curve we currently sit. What the evidence does suggest, with reasonable confidence, is that the civilizations in this documentary almost certainly did not believe, at their peaks, that they were approaching a threshold. The administrators of the Bronze Age palace states were managing what appeared to be a functioning and resilient system. The Maya kings commissioning monuments in the 8th century CE were building for permanence. The Chaco Canyon pilgrimage economy was drawing resources from across the Colorado Plateau, with no apparent awareness that the institutional authority sustaining those flows was contingent on conditions that were about to change. Civilizations, as a general principle, do not feel fragile from the inside. They feel, to the people living within them, like the permanent condition of the world. This is what the evidence suggests. The interpretation is yours. What history offers us, in cases like these, is not prophecy. It does not tell us what will happen. It tells us what has happened, under conditions that bear certain structural resemblances to conditions that currently exist. Whether those resemblances are close enough to be cautionary or distant enough to be merely interesting is a judgment that requires weighing evidence that reasonable people interpret differently. What is not a matter of reasonable disagreement is this. Every civilization that appears in this documentary was, to its inhabitants, permanent. The Indus Valley people did not think of themselves as living in the Bronze Age. They thought of themselves as living in the world. The Mycenaean palace administrators filling out their Linear B tablets were not recording the final entries of a dying civilization. They were doing their jobs in a system that had functioned for generations, on a day that felt like every other day, until it did not. The complexity that built everything we have examined in this documentary was real. The achievements were genuine. The cities were magnificent, and the silence that followed them was, in every case, deeper than anyone inside them could have imagined. That silence is the data. What we choose to do with it is something else entirely. In the spring of 2018, a team of researchers flying over the northern Guatemalan lowlands in a small aircraft equipped with a laser mapping system looked at their data screens and saw a civilization they had not expected to find, not a new civilization. The Maya had been studied by archaeologists for over a century. The sites were mapped. The major cities were known. The scholarly literature on the classic Maya filled entire library wings. And yet what the LiDAR data streaming across those screens revealed was a landscape so densely and so completely transformed by human hands, so covered in structures, causeways, agricultural terracing, and water management infrastructure that the existing maps of Maya settlement, built painstakingly over decades of ground survey and conventional aerial photography, had captured perhaps a fraction of what was actually there. Thomas Garrison of Ithaca College, one of the lead researchers on the PACUNAM LiDAR initiative, described the experience as looking at an entirely new world. The sheer density of previously unknown structures revealed by the survey, over 60,000 individual features identified in the initial analysis of roughly 800 square miles, required a fundamental revision of population estimates, agricultural models, and collapse theories that had been considered settled for years. This is what is happening right now in the archaeology of vanished civilizations. Not the slow accumulation of incremental findings that confirms what was already suspected, but genuine revision, the kind that changes the questions rather than just the answers. The PACUNAM survey has continued since 2018, expanding its coverage across the Guatemalan Petén and into adjacent regions of Belize and Mexico. Each new survey area adds thousands of previously unknown structures to the record. Cities that were considered modest secondary centers have turned out to be major urban nodes. The causeways connecting those cities straight, raised roads running for miles through swampy terrain, form a network of regional integration that makes the Maya lowlands look less like a collection of independent city-states and more like a single, deeply interconnected urban system. The implications for understanding how that system could have collapsed continue to be worked through by researchers across multiple institutions. The Indus script presents a different kind of race, not against the jungle, but against the limits of current analytical tools. The script remains undeciphered, but the tools available for attacking that problem have changed significantly in the past decade. Researchers at the Indraprastha Institute of Information Technology, Delhi, and at other institutions have applied machine learning models trained on known ancient writing systems to the Indus corpus, attempting to identify structural patterns that might indicate grammatical features, word boundaries, or phonetic elements. The results have been suggestive rather than conclusive. The computational analyses have identified patterns consistent with a structured writing system rather than a simple pictographic notation, which is itself a meaningful finding, but no breakthrough decipherment has achieved broad scholarly acceptance. What makes the Indus script problem particularly challenging is the absence of a bilingual text. Every major ancient script decipherment in the historical record, Egyptian hieroglyphics via the Rosetta Stone, Linear B via Michael Ventris's recognition of its relationship to an early form of Greek, Mayan glyphs via the combined work of Yuri Knorozov and subsequent epigraphers, has depended on either a bilingual text or a surviving related language. For the Indus script, neither currently exists. The language underlying the script is unknown. Its relationship to any known ancient or modern language family remains a matter of active and unresolved debate. The search continues, and it is not merely academic. If the Indus script is ever deciphered, it will open a window into the largest Bronze Age civilization on Earth, a window that has been sealed for nearly 4,000 years. At Cahokia, ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in recent years have begun to reveal subsurface features, structures, burials, storage pits that were not visible in earlier excavations conducted with less sophisticated technology. The picture of the city that is emerging from this ongoing work is more complex and more spatially extensive than previous surveys had suggested. Residential areas that had been assumed to be peripheral are turning out to be more densely occupied than previously mapped. The boundaries of the city, already larger than most people realize, keep expanding as the surveys continue. Archaeologists have noted that we are, in a meaningful sense, still in the early stages of understanding most of the sites in this documentary. The technologies that are currently transforming the field, LiDAR, ground-penetrating radar, ancient DNA analysis, high-resolution isotope studies of human remains and food residues, satellite multispectral imaging capable of identifying subsurface features from orbit, were not available, or not available at their current levels of precision and cost-effectiveness, even 20 years ago. What they are revealing, consistently and across multiple sites and civilizations, is that the scale of what was built, the complexity of how it was organized, and the depth of what was lost are all larger than the previous generation of researchers had estimated. History is not a closed book. It is a book that is still being written not by the civilizations that are gone, but by the people who are still looking for them. In jungle canopies penetrated by lasers, in sediment cores pulled from the bottoms of ancient lakes, in the grids of pixelated data streaming across screens in aircraft flying over landscapes that have not given up all of their secrets yet. The civilizations went silent. The search for them has not. We began this documentary with a city, not ruins, not rubble. A city with streets and drainage systems and granaries stocked and ready, with 5 million people going about the ordinary business of being alive. And then the image of that city, held in the mind for a moment, and then nothing. The silence where the city used to be, the question of what happened to it, and why, and whether the answer to that question should concern us. We have spent 2 hours now moving through the evidence, the Indus Valley and its sealed script, the Bronze Age and its unanswered letters, the Maya and their laser-revealed cities swallowed by jungle, the ancestral Puebloans and their roads built toward horizons that no longer held what they once promised, Cahokia and its forgotten mound, Roanoke and its carved word pointing toward an answer no one followed quickly enough to find. And now we are at the end, which means it is time to say the thing that the evidence, honestly examined, actually supports. None of these civilizations knew they were ending. That is not a poetic observation. It is an archaeological one. The Linear B tablets from Pylos record grain distributions and military preparations right up until the palace burned. The Ugarit letter was still in the kiln. The Maya scribes were still carving dates into stone monuments in the decades before the last monument was carved. The Chaco Canyon great houses were still being maintained, still receiving pilgrims, still functioning as the center of a regional ceremonial system, until the generation that abandoned them. These were not civilizations that saw the end coming and recorded their awareness of it. They were civilizations that were doing what they had always done, in a world that felt permanent, on days that felt ordinary. The permanence was not a delusion. It was a reasonable inference from the evidence available to the people living inside those civilizations. Mohenjo-Daro had been a functioning city for 500 years before it was abandoned. The Hittite Empire had been a great power for 3 centuries before it ceased to exist within a generation. The Maya southern lowlands had supported dense urban civilization for 600 years before the terminal classic drought began. From the inside, at any given moment, a civilization that has been working for 500 years has every reason to expect that it will continue working. The past is the strongest available predictor of the near future, and the past of every civilization in this documentary was a very long record of continuity. And yet, here is the question that this documentary leaves with you. And it is not a rhetorical one. It is a genuine question. What would future archaeologists make of our cities if they found them empty? Not what caused the emptiness, that is a separate question, and one that the evidence from the cases in this documentary suggests would be multiply-caused and systemically complex and resistant to any single clean explanation. But what would they make of what we left behind? The infrastructure, the supply chains, whose physical traces would be written into the geography of every continent, the data centers whose server halls would stand as the granaries of our civilization, stocked in the moment before the silence, with more information than any previous civilization had ever produced. The roads, the ports, the satellites, still in their orbits, still transmitting to receivers that no one was operating anymore. They would find, as archaeologists always find, a civilization that had been, by its own internal logic, permanent. A civilization that had been building for the future, investing in infrastructure, accumulating knowledge, extending its networks right up until the moment it was not. Archaeologists have noted, across every case in this documentary, that the silence in the record does not arrive with warning. It arrives the way the Bronze Age ended mid-sentence, with a letter still in the kiln. The silence is not preceded by a period of recorded awareness. It is preceded by ordinary days. The civilizations that vanished were not failures. They were achievements extraordinary, in some cases magnificent achievements that encountered conditions their complexity could no longer manage. The Indus Valley people did not fail to build a sophisticated civilization. They built one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world, and they sustained it for 700 years. What ended them was not a lack of achievement. It was a specific convergence of stresses at a specific moment in a specific landscape, a convergence that their civilization, for all its sophistication, did not survive. We are not them. Our tools are different. Our knowledge is different. Our awareness of the pattern, which is to say, the awareness that this documentary has tried to build across 2 hours of evidence, is something that no previous civilization possessed in this form. Whether that awareness is enough to constitute a meaningful difference is the one question that the archaeological record cannot answer, because the archaeological record only records what has already happened. The silence in the record is not evidence of nothing. It is evidence of something we have not yet learned completely to hear. We are still listening. And for now, that is where the evidence ends, not with a conclusion, but with a question that belongs, like all the most important questions, to the people still alive enough to ask it.